My husband, Don, is a consultant in the field of what's become known as uncrewed aviation. You might know it as drone operations or flying drones. In his field, there are professional associations that promote safety standards and provide accreditation to programs and training in the civilian use of drones, which has just skyrocketed in recent years. Last week, Don attended a conference of one of these associations, and he had a chance to catch up with a colleague. And this colleague, I'll call him Joe, is an expert in analyzing data that comes out of drone reconnaissance flights. This has a bit more of a military application. And somehow this colleague wound up in Ukraine, voluntarily on the ground, training their military to do the same. And he's been back and forth several times in the last 2 years. And Don said he's really worried about his friend because he seemed very tired and depressed. And Joe had shared that the situation on the ground in Ukraine looked bleaker than ever before. And even though Russia has suffered staggering losses, Putin's pursuit continues, and support from Ukraine's allies, including the US, has not been robust for fear of being drawn into a conflict of superpowers that might or might not include the use of nuclear arms. Joe sees the global arena from a different perspective. He's in a unique position to receive news and intelligence from sources much closer and more immediate to Ukraine's situation. And to him, the implications carry more weight than most anyone he relates to in the States. And hearing Joe's story from Don made me wonder, how does Joe carry the weight of his witness and his knowledge of these geopolitical woes? How does he carry that alone? And why would he put himself at risk voluntarily to help defend a country not his own? Well, the minister and me asked Don, does Joe have anyone close he can talk to about his experiences? Does he have a community, a faith, or a practice that provides hope and perhaps a larger sense of meaning? I mean, the war in Ukraine is big, but there is much more to life. Having a faith, having a community, even having somebody in sympathy or empathy who can relate, whom you can talk to, might help ease that burden and relieve the depressing weight of that burden. Well, Don replied, I don't know about any of those things, honey, and I'm not going to ask him. So, in a sense, here this man is surrounded by colleagues who share in his profession, yet I don't know. He's not going to get that kind of embrace from his colleagues, apparently. And maybe it's not appropriate in that context. The truth is that all of us here today share in being a somewhat hapless part of the global arena in which Joe has just a little bit more insight, maybe, and perspective than we do. And even so, we all live under that pall of geopolitical strife, and some of it hits close to home, as we know with the Israeli-Hamas conflict. Many in this congregation have Jewish identity, and have people they know that are suffering, and it is the same in our UUA world for those of Palestinian descent or Palestinian Americans. So in some ways, these conflicts become personal. And when we look at the growing tensions between these global superpowers, we're reminded of the possibility of nuclear warfare. And overlay that with global warming, a prediction of a global financial recession, our own wonky economy, an impending presidential election, and then add whatever personal struggles we're experiencing. If we find ourselves anxious and fearful, is it any wonder? Whether as individuals or as a community, the problem of being anxious, however, is the condition tends to make us fearful and reactive. And fear can make us angry, defensive, and insular. Carrying the weight of the world on our shoulders can make us weary, depressed, and worst of all, hopeless. Recently, I ran across an interview with Wahajat Ali. He is a Pakistani-American writer, columnist, public speaker, and family man. The interview was from 2020 during the pandemic, and Ali described the experience of his young daughter's battle with liver cancer in the midst of COVID. She survived. But during the ordeal, Ali, as a father, had to face having no control over his daughter's disease. He had no power to save her. Ali shared what he learned about being hopeful when circumstances seemed to dictate otherwise. First, Ali said that he learned to let go of what he couldn't control, and that was his daughter's cancer. And instead, he immersed himself in what he could. And what he could do, he put so endearingly, he said, I watched 39 times, I watched Frozen, Zootopia 46 times, and Moana 56 times while sitting alongside his daughter in her hospital bed. Those are all Disney movies that kind of have a feminine hero theme to them. At the same time, when he was doing what he could and repeatedly watching these films, and also playing Legos, he said, with his daughter, that instead of focusing on worst case scenarios, he invested in a narrative of hope. He invested in a narrative of hope. He said that, of course, he thought out the eventuality of losing his daughter to cancer, but that he clung to, and again, endearingly, he clung to an image of a superhero. Dr. Strange, I think he said, and said of saving his daughter. Interesting. When we think about the 24-hour news cycle and being bombarded with daily messages of doom and gloom, it's too easy to fall into apathy and cynicism. And interestingly, Ali refers to apathy and cynicism as the kind of negativity that equates to yelling boo from the cheap seats. It's easy to fall prey to cynicism because being hopeful means risking your heart. To be hopeful means being on the ground and in the game where you might get a bloody nose, where when your narrative of hope doesn't pan out. But Ali says at least when you're on the ground, when you're risking that bloody nose or a broken heart, at least you're moving the ball forward. While apathy and nihilism seem to be our human defaults these days, apathy, Ali calls cowardice, and of course, nihilism can be destructive. It's for the benefit of us all to invest in a narrative of hope. And I might add, not only as we live in these chaotic times as a group, but also individually. Not one among us can know what the future will bring. And in my years as a pastoral caregiver, I've witnessed people facing difficulty of some kind involving relationships, their health, their safety, and security. And most of the time, those folks would ruminate over the many ways that things could go from bad to worse. Yet rarely did things turn out as they predicted. If we're going to predict the future, why not predict a positive outcome? Why not invest in a narrative of hope? Now, I know that some of you have real lived experiences of this, and that's your story to tell. Viktor Frankl said that everything can be taken from a man, can be taken from a man, but one thing, the last of the human freedoms to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way. Everything can be taken from a person, but the human freedom to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances. In a Nazi death camp, Frankl learned that even when faced with certain death, those who had hope bound up in a faith or a life lived with meaning and love, they were able to increase their chances of surviving over those who fell in with despair and hopelessness. Few of us will be faced with such horrifying circumstances, yet in our everyday lives, we can be overcome by narratives of hopelessness and despair. Not only is that bad for our mental health and our relationships with others, but it's also bad for our spirits. That's why we need connections with others that remind us of the fact that we humans don't do well with being islands unto ourselves. Being an introvert is one thing. Living your life in seclusion is another. We're just not wired for it, if nothing else. We need communities like this fellowship that call us to discern what is true for us and to make meaning in our lives, lest we turn inward in fear, lest we try and abide these extraordinary times alone without a faith, without a sense of something more to this existence than the sum of our parts. Without a sense of awe and largesse, without a sense of being part of the why of this life, even if it remains a mystery for us, until we can feel connected within this interdependent web of all existence, and with an awareness of that which is so much greater than our lives on this planet. Without that, we risk failing to live into a hopeful, faithful, and loving narrative. Hope, faith, and love are the eternal qualities of our human lives that never wanes or dissipates. Hope and faith build the spiritual fortitude that allows us to face the possibility of losing a young daughter to cancer, to face what seems like a world on fire, or to face the horrors of war. This fellowship, the Unitarian Universalist Fellowship of Boca Raton, you, the congregation, together, you are facing an uncertain future. An uncertain future as a congregation in the context of these unprecedented hard times. I feel keenly in these last days of my interim ministry with you that I'm waving from the shore as you drift off on your continued journey. But I hope that you will see that it has always been you together as a community of faith. It has always been you who must be the intrepid navigators. You have always been the ones you've been waiting for. You've always been a house of hope in all times. Live into that. I can tell you this, if you aren't feeling what I'm describing as this sense of hope and faith and community, please know that there is someone who left you a legacy of lasting love in faith and in hope. Yesterday, we celebrated the life of Louise Malusis, beloved member of this congregation who died 1 week ago, yesterday. And in sharing remembrances of her life, as a family member and a member of this congregation, it became obvious that Louise believed in you. So if you aren't feeling quite brave enough in the face of the unknown and the face of adversity, if you aren't quite seeing your way to the future, please ask yourself or someone here who knew her well, what would Louise do? How would she respond to the challenges of congregational life? From whence came her hope, faith, and love?